Okay, let's revise some AQA Philosophy A level. Oh, this computer has me in a little picture in the bottom right. Do I want that? Why not? I guess it doesn't matter. Okay, great. Here's a little reminder of how to revise. If you're watching this last minute, this will be useless to you. I'm not going to read it all through. This is something I make for my students at the start of revision, but use it if it's helpful to you. More usefully, potentially, here is the big master table of past paper questions there have been for this topic in AQA philosophy. Let me see if I can get my laser pointer on. Bear with me. Yeah, here we go. So it used to be, remember, this is the first time, if you're watching this in 2019, that the Metaphysics of God material, as it's now known, has been examined using the A2 Year 13 Upper 6th format. So there used to be 2 markers, 5 marker, 9 marker, 9 marker, 15 marker. It's now a 3 marker, 5 marker, 5 marker, 12 marker, and 25 marker. So there are old 2 markers. The old 2 markers were on definitions. Definition of everlasting, eternal, Anselm's definition of God, what are blicks for hair. EV, sorry, stands for eschatological verification. Hard to fit that in a box. The specimen A2 paper. So remember, we only have one specimen paper at the moment for Metaphysics of God in A2 mark format. So that's all we've really got to go on, which means it could be anything that comes up. But we can make little guesses here. So the specimen question for this topic was eternal and everlasting. So they combined 2 of the old ones together. What's the difference between eternal and everlasting? So this strongly suggests the 3 marker, as you might expect anyway, is going to be some kind of definition question, maybe looking at 2 similar terms and the difference between them. But yeah, some kind of definitional question. Make sure you know the definitions of the different terms for this paper, your keywords, the things from the concept of God section in particular, perhaps. What do those different terms mean? And just, yeah, all the key terms for this paper. 5 marker in the past has been on the paradox of the stone, Descartes' ontological argument, the problem of evil, the Kalam argument, Aquinas' second way, and the evidential problem of evil. So what could it be for the 2019 paper? Anything, who knows? That doesn't really give us much of a clue. Something short. Outline this for 5 marks. Something little. The first 9 marker previously has been on the free will defense, Mitchell's view of religious language, the Euthyphro dilemma, problem of evil, and Hicks' response. The Euthyphro dilemma again. So maybe they like Euthyphro for this question. Maybe you'll get a 5 marker on Euthyphro, but on the other hand, maybe they've asked about it before, so that they're not going to repeat it. Who knows? And Aquinas' third way. So yeah, it could really be anything, but I've noticed the paradox of the stone hasn't appeared for a while, so I wonder if that will come up as one of the 5 markers. We'll see. But really anything. The 12 marker, sorry, the 9 marker, the second 9 marker previously has been on eschatological verification, Swinburne's teleological argument, that must be, I think, one of Aquinas' ways, omniscience, Paley's teleological argument, and design arguments in general. In fact, sorry, that was Paley compared with Swinburne, wasn't it? So using that same tactic they used up here of getting you to synthesize information by comparing 2 different conceptual sets. So what could it be? Anything. I'm sorry, it's hard to predict, it's hard to guess. However, perhaps most interestingly, let's do a bit of guessing for the essay question. So the essay question, the 15 marker in the past, has been on the cosmological argument, the problem of evil, religious language, ontological argument, problem of evil again, and religious language again. And that's for the specimen. This tells me that it's very, very, very unlikely that they will give for the 2019 paper a 25 marker on religious language. I think that's highly unlikely. If I was a betting man, I might actually not even revise detailed analysis of the religious language problems, and in fact that probably suggests some elements of religious language are going to appear earlier in the paper, but don't shoot me if that's wrong. And I've got a feeling, my gut feeling is that they're going to go with design. Again, I could be completely wrong, but hasn't appeared within recent memory as an essay question, and also the old AS exemplar essay used to be on design. So I think it would make sense for them to ask on design, but really it could be on anything. Again, except quite probably not on religious language. Okay, let's keep going. Here are all the arguments that you will need to know about for this paper. We're going to cover them all in this video though, so let's continue. So first of all, for this paper, you need to know about the concept and nature of God, don't you? First, to begin with, you need to know about God's attributes, and you need to know about these in more detail than you did for, say, GCSE RE, if you did that, don't you? These are obvious candidates, aren't they, by the way, for definitional questions, although they've used eternal and everlasting recently. But they might ask you about one of the omnis. Don't call them the omnis, by the way, as my students sometimes do. You know them more precisely than that. So God is omniscient, all-knowing. Aquinas would say means he knows everything that is logically possible to know. Omnipotent, able to do everything possible. Someone like Descartes would say this means can do absolutely literally everything and anything, even things which are not logically possible, because Descartes had that view of God's power. Again, someone like Aquinas would say, no, this means he can do everything which it is logically possible to do. Supremely good or omnibenevolent, they prefer supremely good. Omnibenevolent would be literally all well wanting, wouldn't it? Supremely good, remember, that can have an ontological or a moral sense. So it could be supremely good in the sense of the most perfect being, the best being around, or it could be in the sense of moral perfection. So the being that is morally the best and from which the standard of good comes. That relates to the Euthyphro dilemma, doesn't it? Just as the definition of omnipotence you choose relates to the paradox of the stone. And the meanings of those, yeah, we've just talked about the meanings. Definitions of those terms given precisely could come up for 3-mark questions. Competing views then on such a being's relationship to time, including God being timeless and God being within time, eternal and everlasting. So remember, eternal means atemporal. If God's eternal, he's outside time. He, at least in part or originally, is not on the same space-time continuum as we are, so he has no beginning and no end, but that's because it doesn't even make sense to talk about such a being as having a beginning and an end. Time just simply does not apply to this being. And then God being within time, everlasting, again, be clear, still means God doesn't have a beginning or an end, but that's because God has always existed within time. His existence goes back into the past infinitely, everlastingly towards the past. And in the future, God will always continue to exist. So he will have no end either. He lasts forever. That's what everlasting means. So they're similar but very different. You may have read the tough set text from, who's it from? Stump and Kretzmann on eternity or eternality and everlastingness, and how such a being can relate to time. I'd be very surprised if they give you a 25 marker on that, but hopefully you could outline, if it comes up in a later question, how these different understandings of God work and function. And then you might also get explain and outline questions on these problems, mightn't you? The paradox of the stone. So could God create a stone so heavy that he could not lift it? If you do get that, for all of these, make sure you spell out each logical step of the problem precisely and properly. So it's not just that one sentence summary. Go through the different options. While this could be the case, that there is such a stone, but that's problematic because then it seems there is something that God cannot do. Therefore, how can he be omnipotent? Then other option, or maybe God can lift it, but then again, you ruled out another possibility for his omnipotence. So it's problematic both ways. You won't, by the way, remember, need to talk about responses to the paradox of the stone unless it asks for that specifically. But it's not actually on the spec, as you can see, so I'd be very surprised if they ask you for responses to any of these. By the way, I think that's also a strong indicator that you won't get a 25 marker on the concept and nature of God. It's never happened before. This is like the definitional stuff at the beginning of the course. Then you have the Euthyphro dilemma. So remember, the original form in Plato's dialogue, Euthyphro, is about gods and piety, isn't it? So do the gods define what is pious / holy, or is what is pious/holy dictated to the gods. In modern form, applied to goodness and morality, does God decide what is good, or does God have to follow what is good? And again, you don't just give the one sentence version if you get a question on it. You trot through the logic of why it's a problem. You spell out the precise details of the difficulty. So option one, if God decides what's good, this seems counterintuitive and problematic because he would be able to, for example, decree that murder is good. Very good book on this, by the way, by Kierkegaard called Fear and Trembling. That's very extracurricular though. And that seems highly problematic. Or alternative, what is good is dictated to him by some higher external standard. Problem there though, that it seems to make something higher than God and above God. God's answerable to logic, which seems to come ontologically prior to him in some way. So that's also a difficulty. There are ways of responding to that, aren't there, from Aquinas and Kierkegaard and others. However, it doesn't say responses, so you don't. It's great, well done for your teacher for enriching your life and talking to you about those, but you don't actually need them according to the specification. And then lastly, the compatibility or otherwise of the existence of an omniscient God and free human beings. So again, it's very easy to sum up that problem in one sentence, isn't it? If God knows everything and knows the future, how can we freely decide the future? Because it seems to be already fixed and necessary what it is. But again, just make sure you can go through the precise logical problems of that in an answer, so the examiner can give you all the marks for it. You've really explained every step of that problem. So what omniscience means, what it means about God's knowledge of the future, what that means about the status of the necessary status of future events, then perhaps a definition of freedom. So for example, if freedom means being able to do otherwise or being able to change the future and the future's fixed, then such an attribute appears to be inconsistent with human freedom. Do you see that's more precise than just saying if God knows the future, then we can't have freedom. You got to go through, spell out the inferences. That's what I always say to my students. Right, then you need to know about ontological arguments, don't you? So to begin with, by the way, this list is much shorter than it used to be. You can be thankful for that. St. Anselm's ontological argument. Remember, this appears first in chapter 2 of his Proslogion, so it's confusingly known as Proslogion 2. This is the that than which nothing greater can be conceived one. So Anselm says God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. It's greater to exist than not exist is effectively how you could render his next premise. Therefore, the being that is the greatest must actually exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be that than which nothing greater can be conceived, because the greater being, then that would be the one that actually exists. So this being, God, actually exists. Remember, he updates that in the face of Galnillo's perfect island objection. I think it makes sense to go there next. So Galnillo had an epistolic conversation with Anselm, didn't he? And said, well, this argument is absurd, or you can at least reduce it to absurdity, reductio ad absurdum, by applying it to any object. Take an island. Imagine the island, the greatest possible island, the island greater than which no other island can be conceived of. The best island, the perfect island, obviously exists by that logic, doesn't it? Because if it didn't, it wouldn't be the greatest possible island. So the greatest possible island out there must actually exist. But this seems absurd, so he's reduced the argument to absurdity in his objection. So Anselm updates his ontological argument, doesn't he, in Proslogion 3, by adding in the idea of necessary existence. He makes God a unique case, because God's case is unique because he is the only necessary being. So God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and exists necessarily. That's what makes him different from all the other objects and beings in the universe. So it's simply because it's part of the definition of God that he exists necessarily. When you add that to the idea of him being the greatest possible being, that allows him to be in a set of his own as the greatest possible being who exists necessarily. That is why he contains his the necessity of existence within himself. So that's the update for Proslogion 3. Hopefully you've been through an analytic version of that in your lessons. This is just triggering your own memory for revision, isn't it? And helping to plug any gaps, hopefully. Descartes' ontological argument is one of the easier ones as well, isn't it, that you can do in a nice tidy set of premises, even though he wrote it in French prose, and that French or Latin, French, I think this one, maybe he did two different versions. Irrelevant, Dr. Tarasenko. So God is a supremely perfect being for Descartes, isn't he? A supremely perfect being contains all perfections. Existence is a perfection, therefore God exists. Therefore God, the perfect being, must exist. Easy peasy. We'll do objectives in a moment. Malcolm's one, remember, is trying to resurrect Anselm's Proslogion 3. He does actually acknowledge it's probably not going to convince anybody. However, the twist in the tale this time is that the definition is of God as an unlimited being, isn't it? So God is an unlimited being. If God does actually exist, then he's always existed in the past, because that's what an unlimited being would do, and will always exist in the future, and has always existed at all times. So either God always exists and has always existed, or never exists. And because it's not a logical impossibility that such a being exists, if he exists at any point, and it's logically possible that he exists at all, then he must exist at all points. I've made a bit of a botch of that summary, but the difference is, isn't it, that he is defining God as an unlimited being and feeding that definition into his own logic. So that should, I hope, help you to remember Malcolm's own version, unlimited being. That's the difference. We've looked at Galilei's perfect island objection. Empiricist objections to these a priori deductive arguments, that's what they are, aren't they? Have to do with how you can't prove the existence of anything a priori relations of ideas. Here's Hume's fork again, by the way. It's Hume's fork, isn't it? Or A is verification principle. All they can ever show is precisely that, relations of ideas, logical truths, analytic necessities that only exist as relations between concepts in our mind. You can never jump from that to the existence of a being in actuality, because in order to know something exists in actuality, you have to experience it through your senses. So that's where the empiricists are coming from. That's where many 21st century people in the West are coming from. So they're going to just flat out disagree with ontological arguments for those reasons, aren't they? And Kant's is the most famous objection, though, isn't it? That existence is not a predicate. In other words, existence is not a property. If you want to take Frege's route, actually, it's a second order predicate. It's a property of properties. But the point Kant is making here is, well, remember his illustration that if you imagine an object or some object, say 100 coins, and imagine, they're gold, round, etc., etc., and then suddenly add the idea to that they exist, your image, your picture of them, your concept, he would say, in your mind, doesn't actually change at all. This shows that existence cannot be a property. If existence isn't a property, then the arguments collapse, according to Kant, because they depend on that idea. I think you see that most clearly with Descartes' argument, where he's saying God is a supremely perfect being. Perfect beings possess the property, the perfection of existence. You could sub in property for perfection there, as I just did. So the arguments crumble in the face of that. Remember, Kant has another objection, actually, doesn't he, though? That if you can show the necessity of a concept of existing, that doesn't mean that the being which that concept is of actually exists in reality. I think that's actually a more fecund and potent objection, but these are the ones on the specification, aren't they? You've probably written an essay on ontological arguments at some point in your philosophical career. Make sure you have that plan up your sleeve for the exam, because they could ask you, do the ontological arguments prove, like deductive arguments try to prove things, that God exists? Next up, we have teleological and design arguments. Now, the design argument from analogy presented by Hume is new to the spec for this new examination. I've glossed that in my lessons, so my students look out for that in particular. I would suggest going over the textbook on that again. It's just the basic form of the design argument as Hume knew it. So basically saying that the universe as a whole is analogous to a designed object because it contains order and purpose, and from this we can infer abductively, although Hume wouldn't call it that, I suppose, the existence of a designer who designed it and brought it about. That's the sort of basic version that was knocking around that Hume was dealing with. Remember, Paley came after Hume, and his version is very similar to that, but he focuses on the watch analogy, doesn't he? In that famous passage at the start of his Natural Theology, where you find a watch, you knock into it with your foot perhaps while wandering around on a heath. Remember, it's Swinburne who called that the argument from spatial order, but that's what Paley's saying, isn't he? He's saying that the universe is like a watch because it displays order and purpose in spatial terms. In other words, if you look at the interconnections within the space in the stuff of the universe, they show great order and complexity. And just like we wouldn't say a watch would just come together randomly, that analogous order in the universe suggests a designer. There have been huge discussions and interpretations, well, huge in the world of philosophy, about just how Paley's argument works, whether it's deductive, inductive, and so on. You can make your own judgments on that. Remember, as long as you present a clear, precise version as you know it, you can present it in either way and still get marks. One of the mark schemes, previous mark schemes, has gone into lots of detail about that. Swinburne's design argument is tricky, isn't it? My students often struggle with this one. So this is the argument from temporal order and regularity. In other words, it's arguing not from order in space, but order in time. What does he mean by that? Well, what he actually means is the existence of laws of nature in the universe, the fact that things happen in the universe in a regular way, in time, one after the other, regularly. Things like the laws of gravity. What he's saying is that the explanations of science can't actually explain why there are scientific laws of nature at all. And given that we have other examples of order in time that we can explain through the actions of free agents, like, for example, a dancer dancing in a dance, or a singer singing a song, because that involves order throughout time, things happen in a certain sequence, we can explain those as the actions of free agents. Therefore, by analogy, why not, or sorry, it makes sense to explain the laws of nature, a temporal order, in terms of the actions of a supreme free agent, which is what we can call God. So it's another design argument from analogy, but arguing from temporal order. Or maybe if it's not, even if he's drawing analogies, and you don't want to call it from analogy, it's an inductive argument, arguing back from laws of nature, the fact that things happen in a regular, ordered way in time in the universe, to a designer who must have brought that about. I hope that's helped a little bit, if that's a tricky one for you. All sorts of problems with these arguments, although I actually think they're the strongest arguments for the existence of God myself. Not really convinced by cosmological, ontological. Personally, I think you get a version of the design argument possibly in Romans 1, but yeah, I think it's the strongest argument. People have objected though, haven't they? Hume thinks arguments from analogy are always weak, and they depend on the similarity between the two things being analogized, and he thinks the similarity in this case is the similarities are not strong. He has all sorts of objections really, which you have studied, but that's one of them, which is that arguments from analogy in general are weak. There's the problem of spatial disorder as well, another Humean one, and one that Paley himself raises and discusses. What's this? This is just the fact that there are very disordered things in the universe, like evil and suffering and chaos and mess. So if it's meant to be all look so ordered and complex and intricately put together, why is there all this mess in it, this spatial disorder? Isn't that going to work against the argument? There's a link there to the problem of evil, isn't there? But you don't have to write synoptic essays for Metaphysics of God. Here's a, I think, very strong one. By the way, I'm doing my own analysis here, aren't I? You should have, as with all of the issues you've looked at, your own analysis of all of these in case you get an essay. The design argument fails as it is an argument from a unique case. So in other words, we may have loads of watches, loads of pretty intricately designed or formed flowers and so on in the universe, but we only have one universe, as one philosopher puts it. Oh, here, what does he say? He says universes are not as plentiful as blackberries. So how do we know that what applies to watches, to blackberries, to pretty flowers applies to the universe itself? Because this is a unique case where we can't observe what predates the existence of the universe. So you're trying to draw a correspondence where actually there's only one thing in the set that you can correspond to all the other things in the set of designed things. So who knows? It's unique. Why can you even make this comparison to the universe at all? And then of course whether God is the best or only explanation of the apparent design in the universe. Maybe maybe it isn't God. Maybe it's just a supreme intelligence. Maybe it was evolution that brought about the appearance of order and intricate structure in organic life on Earth. If you want to go wacky, maybe it was aliens, maybe it was UFOs, maybe it was weird space monsters, um, maybe it was something from Marvel Comics, who knows? Who knows? Or what does Aster Hume say? Maybe it was a team of gods, maybe it was an incompetent god, a crackpot god, an infant god. This is just making the point that it doesn't necessarily get you to the god of classical theism, does it, the design argument? You might need other arguments to get there as well. Always worth discussing that in an essay on design arguments if you think it is a weighty point. And even if it's not weighty, you can bring it up and then dismiss it as not that big a deal.
Okay, just to warn you, the sound is now going to change on this video because I'm finishing recording it in a different location in school, so you may need to turn up the volume on your device. I apologize for that. By the way, something I like to do sometimes when listening to videos such as these is to put other music on in the background and then blend the sounds, although you probably don't need to do that because my dulcet tones are so mesmerizing just by themselves. Alright, so we come now to cosmological arguments, of which there are many on your specification. You need to know about loads of cosmological arguments, don't you? Starting with the Kalam argument from temporal causation put forward or resurrected by William Craig, which is a syllogism in form, isn't it? Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And he adds on an extra step, a second conclusion, that this cause must be atemporal and timeless, therefore timeless and spaceless and extremely powerful, because only such a cause would have the ability to bring about the space-time universe and would transcend it. And oh yeah, it has to be personal because it chooses to bring such universe about. That's the Kalam argument. Then you've got Aquinas' first three ways, which are all cosmological arguments. So the argument from motion, things move. This chain of movement must begin somewhere because it can't go on forever. Therefore, there must be an initial prime mover which gives motion to the whole system and starts the whole thing off. That's a very condensed summary, but I'm just triggering your own memories from your own in-deep revision, aren't I, in this video. The second way, from atemporal causation, is very similar, isn't it, in structure. It's just swapping in causation, cause and effect, in the sense of Aristotle's efficient cause, for motion. So things happen, things move from potentiality to actuality in Aristotle's terms, and this chain of cause and effect cannot go on forever. So all of these arguments use the idea that infinite regress is not possible, don't they? Therefore, it must have been begun, or it must have its originating source in an atemporal cause, which we call God. And then the third way, the most complex one, which has even more steps, which I probably won't be able to trot out in condensed summary off the top of my head, but there are contingent things in the universe which exist. They might not have existed because they're contingent. Therefore, you could hypothesize that there was nothing at one point that existed, but nothing cannot come from nothing. Therefore, once again, there must be a necessary being, a necessary cause, on a sort of on an existence plane of its own. So in all of these arguments, it's not saying God is the first link in the chain. Really, it's saying that God is is where the chain comes from. He's not a part of the chain. He's the source of the chain on a different plane, as it were. Yeah. So God is the necessary reality which all the contingent things in the universe depend on for their existence, because they couldn't have created themselves, and there can't be an infinite chain of contingent things. Similar logic in all of them, but you need to be able to differentiate between them and outline them as precisely as you can, like with all of these arguments. Then Descartes' argument based on his continuing existence, one of his arguments for the existence of God, which also came up in epistemology. So this is the one that's interwoven with the trademark argument, very confusingly, in the Meditations. But this is a similar style of thought to Aquinas' contingency argument, actually, but just about himself, isn't it? So he exists from moment to moment. However, he is not powerful enough to preserve himself in existence, or even initially cause himself to exist. And yeah, by the causal adequacy principle, which Descartes inherited from scholasticism, medieval philosophy, an effect such as his existence must have as much, a cause of an effect must have as much or more reality than the effect. In other words, you need a sufficient reason for everything that happens to have happened. Descartes doesn't think he is a sufficient enough reason to cause himself to exist moment by moment, and he's not aware of doing that. So it must be God who preserves him in existence in each moment, because only the being God is powerful enough to do that. And then, very similar, Leibniz's argument from the principle of sufficient reason, but applying that principle now not to the existence of himself, but the existence of all the contingent things in the universe. So that's extremely similar, isn't it, to Aquinas' third way. There are contingent things. You can't explain the chain of contingent realities happening one after the other in terms of purely contingent things, because it would go back on forever and ever and ever, and that isn't an explanation, that's just a regression that never stops. So there must be a necessary being which preserves all of these contingent things in existence and on which they depend for their existence. Those are my condensed summaries of the cosmological arguments to remind you. All sorts of issues with those, though, aren't there. If you think an infinite series is possible, then you're going to object to most, if not all, of these cosmological arguments, except perhaps the Kalam argument. Hume has complicated, problematic things to say about causality, doesn't he? Remember, to Hume's mind, all cause and effect is observing one thing happening after another, a constant conjunction of events. So, for Hume, it doesn't make sense to talk about causes having power in this way. We just make this customary observation, which we turn into the idea of causation. Excuse me, but that's not an observation of anything in reality at all. So you can't use this mysterious idea of causation to argue back towards the cause God, according to Hume. Russell would make the point that these arguments often commit the fallacy of composition. What's that? Remember, that's applying something which is relevant to a unit in a series to the whole series itself. So his classical example, as you remember it, is every human being has a mother. So that's talking about an individual unit in a set or a series. But it does not therefore make sense to say that the human race collectively has a mother. That's nonsense. Each human does, but the whole series, human race, does not have a mother. Russell would say that the cosmological argument is making that same logical fallacy, logical error, by trying to say that the whole universe must have a cause, just because all the events in the universe have a cause. And then the very impossibility of a necessary being, which also is relevant to ontological arguments, isn't it? So Hume and Russell would say this whole notion of a being having necessity, rather than just a concept like 1 + 1 = 2, is ridiculous. Beings can't have necessary existence, because you can always deny the possibility of a being's existence. It's not logically inconsistent to say God might not exist for human Russell, so therefore his existence cannot be necessary, because it's not logically required. It's not required by the dictates of a priori logical thinking and relations of ideas. So there you go, all sorts of problems with cosmological arguments. Once again, as usual, be prepared to analyze them in depth if you get a 25 marker on them, to pick the criticisms here or that you know of that aren't here, that are most weighty, and talk about them in great depth, going back and forth with possible counter criticisms and counter criticisms, so that you make an overall judgment on whether cosmological arguments are successful. Be prepared to do that if you have to. Alright, moving on from arguments for the existence of God, an argument against the existence of God, the problem of evil is something else you need to know about. So whether God's attributes can be reconciled with the existence of evil. First of all, make sure you can distinguish between moral and natural evil. That would make sense as a 3-mark definition question, I think. So moral evil is evil / suffering that is brought about by the choice of agents, isn't it? Such as humans or angels, perhaps, for Plantinga, like murder, good old murder, classic example. I probably shouldn't have said good old murder. That's not a very good thing to say. Just pretend I didn't say that. I'm not a murderer or a serial killer, by the way, just a philosophy teacher. And natural evil is evil that is part of nature, such as tsunamis, tidal waves. Although remember, confusingly, Plantinga actually thinks natural evil, or suggests at least with Augustine, that natural evil might find its source in moral evil. But that is very confusing and unhelpful of me to say, isn't it? At the basic level, moral evil is chosen, natural evil is part of nature. Then the logical and evidential forms of problem of evil. Don't get caught out by giving the other one if they ask for one of these. The logical form is the one most clearly outlined by Mackey, isn't it? Where you go through the steps of how, if God is omnipotent, then he would have the power to stop evil. If he's omniscient, then he knows about evil. If he's omnibenevolent or supremely good, then he wants to stop it, presumably. In the inconsistent triad, the knowing about it is contained within the power to stop it, isn't it? Because then the third part of the triad is the fact that evil exists. All of these things cannot be held in tension together, says Mackey and other atheists, because of the implications of those first statements I said. Make sure that you properly spell out the inferences as usual, though, and you aren't just drawing a quick triangle and say, this is a problem, they don't fit together. You've got to, as usual, go through the precise logic of why it doesn't work, which you know, you just need to take the time and care to explain it. So that's the deductive analytic version, well, they're both analytic, that's the deductive version, which says God must not exist in its boldest form. The evidential is that, but an inductive version, isn't it? Not saying that God must not exist, but that it's more likely, given the existence of evil, based on that kind of thinking that I've just outlined, that God does not exist. Also because of the sheer amount and the distribution of evil in the world. Famously, this was put forward, among others, by William Rowe, who uses the example of horrendous animal suffering, which appears pointless. Given that there is so much of the suffering in the world, isn't it inductively more likely that God doesn't exist, given that he would have the power to stop it, and would presumably want to? So evidential, just make sure if that comes up, we're talking about the inductive, it's more likely that God does not exist problem. Okay, wow, we're at the 38-minute mark. This is a long video, but that's okay. And I'm going to pause now. Okay, we're back on. Sorry, I just had to pause there because a student came into the classroom looking for something. Right, where were we? Yeah, so we've done different kinds of problem of evil. We're at the 38-minute mark. It's a long video. That's fine, because you need to spend lots of time revising, so I don't mind taking up your time. Hopefully you're doing this with your own notes, by the way, and this is just in addition and additional assistance to your own notes and flashcards and whatever have you. How can a believer deal with the problem of evil and try and respond? Two options, aren't there? Two most famous big options in philosophy. Free will defense. Evil is the result of not God's action, but the action of free agents, which we already said is where moral evil comes from. So this might be better at explaining moral evil than natural evil, which God allows, because allowing freedom to exist allows other higher goods to emerge. So, for example, the Christian line of argument here would be that God made us free because being free means that we can love authentically and properly, because it's impossible to have love without free choice, because you can't love someone if you're forced to do it. It's interesting there that that might be a logical requirement on God. So there's parallels, there's links to be made with Euthyphro and the requirements upon God here, discussed in the concept of God section. But the argument goes, because love and other moral goods, positive moral goods that can only be freely chosen, are so valuable, this means that God allows freedom to exist, even though you get the secondary negative effect of the possibility of evil, which clearly is in the world. There's one line of defense. Maybe quite good for moral evil and the logical problem, less good for natural evil and evidential problem, perhaps. Many have thought that, although, like I said earlier, Plantinga tries to suggest that natural evil might also be explained by the free choices of agents, such as angels or spiritual beings. You could analyze that, make of that what you will. And another style is soul-making. Remember, soul-making, the theodicy way of defending against the problem of evil from John Hick, involves the idea of human free choice as well. It is just coming at the same thing from another angle. It's looking at other second-order goods, as Hick calls them, that emerge from allowing evil to exist. So classically, for example, you can't get compassion, literally with suffering, without suffering, because it would be impossible to exhibit compassion for someone if they weren't in suffering, and then for you to be able to sympathize with them and have that compassion. So second order goods such as compassion, courage, persistence, endurance, and all the kind of good human moral qualities that emerge in the face of evil, because those are valuable, Hick postulates God allows evil to exist, so that we can journey through this veil of soul-making and end up as mature, formed moral characters in the afterlife, which Hick hopes everyone is going to, because he ended up being a universalist. That's not really relevant, sorry, a bit of theology creeping in there. Alright, and finally, the final section you need to know about Metaphysics of God is religious language. You need to, just as with your ethics, be able to distinguish between cognitivism and non-cognitivism about religious language. So a cognitivist view of religious language holds that it actually refers to propositions which could be true or false. And a non-cognitivist or cognitive view of religious language holds that it doesn't refer to propositions that could be true or false. It's so meaningless, it can't even be false, it can't even be wrong. It's just nonsensical. You're not making any proper kind of reference when you speak religiously for a non-cognitivist about religious language. So, confusingly, Aya is a cognitivist about language in general. He thinks it should be able to refer to verifiable facts, but he's non-cognitivist about religious language in the sense that he doesn't think it can do that, because he's an empiricist, a logical positivist, and by his verification principle, which you know, he would challenge it and say, look, it's not logically the case necessarily that God must exist, and we can check whether he exists and see. Well, actually, no. In fact, we can't check that he exists. It's impossible to verify it in experience. There's no experience we can point to. Therefore, it fails the verification principle's tests and is therefore meaningless. It gives you nothing to cognize. It has no cognitive value. Hick, again, comes back to people like Aya, doesn't he, with eschatological verification. His idea that it can be verified. You can verify the existence of God in sense experience, but only as a possibility in the future, eschatologically. Remember, eschatological means to do with the end, eschatos, end in Greek, the end times. So in the future, when we die, we're all on this journey, a pilgrimage to the heavenly city, according to religious believers. We'll either just die and there'll be nothing there, or we will discover that there is a God in an afterlife, in which case it will be verified. So it is possible on weak verificationism, in principle, to check, at least according to Hick's argument. I think he's right on this. This is the subject of an excellent short story by Dr. L.I.T. Tarasenko that might be coming to an obscure sci-fi and fantasy literary magazine near or far away from you soon. My students know about that. Other responses. There's the university debate, which for a long time I thought happened in a university, but actually happened in a journal. That's trivia. Let's stick to the point. What is said in that? Anthony Flew is very similar to Aya, isn't he? but rather than couching it in terms of verification, he talks about it in terms of falsification. You can't falsify whether God exists, as illustrated by the parable of the gardener, where the believer says, oh, well, the gardener's, let's say he's invisible. Oh, and he's unsmellable as well. Oh, he's intangible. So his claim dies the death of 1,000 qualifications, because you could never check if this claim that God exists is wrong, according to Flew, as illustrated by the parable from John Wisdom of the gardener. Therefore, it is meaningless. There's nothing to cognize there. It's completely meaningless. Mitchell comes back in this debate, doesn't he, and says, well, that's not quite fair, along the lines of Hick, perhaps you could say. He argues, no, the religious believer does have evidence that they weigh up, going both ways for God existing and God not existing, just like in a war, a rebel might have evidence for a leader being a partisan or actually being on the enemy's side, and therefore makes a judgment which can be influenced by evidence and in principle can be falsified. So that's Mitchell's response. I also like that. I think that's a very strong response. Another line of response though would be very different, would be Hare's, wouldn't it? Richard Hare's response, which is to say that another way to look at religious language is to see it as, or religious claims, is to see them as worldview ordering claims which have no rational basis of their own and therefore are not susceptible to rational argument, but which frame all of our other beliefs and thinking about the world. So he calls these blicks. So a blick, German for view, is a way of viewing the world which cannot be altered by rational argumentation, but gives a framework to our other beliefs. So his example of a blick is from his parable of the lunatic student, the paranoid student, who just has this blick that his student is, all his teachers, the dons, are out to kill him. I think it's slightly unfortunate that Hare compares religious belief to paranoid schizophrenia. I don't think that's the strongest route to go down defending it, but it's the one he takes. We're stuck with it to learn about. And yeah, I'm starting to analyze again, aren't I? You should be able to analyze all of these different views. Although actually, remember, if you're doing this in 2019, this was the question for the mock exam. So actually, maybe you don't really need to be analyzing these for your A-level exam. Although if you're wider thinking and general enrichment and development as a philosophical, moral, theological thinker, you should be able to analyze them. Cheeky, little bit of advertising at the end to finish this video. If it's been helpful to you and benefited you, please leave me a comment, like, subscribe, etc., etc. Why not give me an endorsement on LinkedIn, help me get jobs, and do look up my fiction on Amazon. Hope that helped you.